Welcome to today's webinar entitled State Preschool Programs Annual Yearbook Update, brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. If you would like to submit a question at any time during the webinar, you may use the chat box at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Simply type your message and click the send button. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Julie Poppy. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon. My name is Julie Poppy, and I'm with the Early Care and Education Project at NCSL, and I thank everyone for being on the webinar call, State Preschool Programs Annual Yearbook Update. Today we have nearly half of the states on the webinar, so that's great. And I'm joined by my colleague, Matt Wire, with the Education Program, and we also have our project staff, Allison May, on the line. We know that some of you may be participating only by phone, and you're not on the webinar platform, and we appreciate your ability to listen in. An archived copy of this webinar will be available and posted to NCSL shortly. Once posted, Allison will send an email out alerting you to the availability of the archived copy. So our goal for the next hour is to make the presentation as interactive as possible. Should you have a question, note that you can type them in at any time in the chat box, like our moderator explained earlier. We'll aim to answer as many questions as possible and during the Q&A, and then also during the conclusion after Steve's presentation. If all the questions aren't answered, we aim to answer them for you, and we'll send an email out with the information. So before I turn the webinar over to our presenter, Steve Barnett, I just want to give you a little information about him. So I'm just going to provide an abbreviated version of his bio. Steve is Board of Governors Professor and Director of the National Institute for Early Education Research at Rutgers University. He has researched the costs and benefits, including long-term effects of preschool programs on children's learning and development. He's best known for his work researching preschool and abecedarian programs. Under Steve's direction, NIEER produces the State Preschool Yearbook, which provides an annual state-by-state analysis of public preschool programs. So for today's webinar, Steve's going to provide some key findings of the annual report and highlight some data and national trends. So this is what we hope we're going to get to today. How many children are enrolled in state-funded preschool programs, the quality of those programs, and the spending of state preschool programs. And then after Steve's presentation, we set aside a few minutes today to take a closer look at a few issues, preschool workforce and dual language learner policies. So my colleague Matt and I will have some specific questions for Steve to dig a little deeper into these topics. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Steve.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see if I can I don't see any slides on my screen.
Do you now?
I do not.
I can forward them for you.
Do you see slides on your screen?
I do. I see slides on my screen.
Okay, well, I have copies, so...
Okay. I'll go ahead and forward them for you.
So if you'll just put us on the agenda slide.
Sure.
I want to thank everyone here today for joining us. We've been collecting survey data on state-funded preschool since 2001. What we have here are the fiscal 2015 data. We provide historical data as well as data for the last completed year. And so I want to tell you both what we found and also what's in the survey in the yearbook that you might want to use at some time in the future, because it's a great resource and we have not nearly enough time to go through all of it. We added this year for the first time 2 new supplemental surveys that we will be going into in a little more depth, one on dual language learner or English language learner policies, and the other on policies relative to the workforce. So if I could have the next slide, and then the slide after that says a peek inside the yearbook, which is really giving you a sense of what's in the yearbook. It begins with an executive summary that provides the big picture for the country. Where are we? What changed? What are the states that stand out? And there's a set of tables that summarize the information across all of the states. Then we have a special report section on dual language learners and on the preschool workforce. Then there's some sections that, if you want to get into the methodology in detail, explain how we did what we did, even how we define what's a state pre-K program. And that's followed by the bulk of the yearbook, which are really what we call state profiles. And that's a description in some depth of each state. That's followed with more on our methodology, and then the appendices that basically have each state's answer to all of the questions, and there are literally hundreds of questions in the survey. We can move to the next slide on survey methodology. As I said, it's a survey we do annually of state-funded pre-K. These data are for the 2014-15 school year. As was mentioned, the three major areas of focus are access or enrollment, resources or spending, and the quality standards benchmarks, which, as I will explain, are really about whether a state hits minimums, not necessarily desirables in terms of quality standards. We survey 57 programs in 42 states, plus one in D.C. As you can tell from those numbers, many of the states have more than one state-funded pre-K programs. 8 states do not, but we do provide information on their Head Start, the federal Head Start program in their states, which some of them may contribute to, and to their preschool special education program. And in the 14-15 school year, Hawaii and Mississippi are included with state programs for the first time, and Indiana is included with the information on its pilot program, although we don't count that as one of the 42 states and 57 programs because it was just a pilot at this point. Next slide. The overview of this, as I said, is we look at enrollment, which increased quite modestly in 14-15. We saw some improvement on quality standards. The slide says quality improved. I want to emphasize what we know about here is policies, so we know that the policies improved. We don't literally know that the quality actually followed. State funding for pre-K increased. Of course, those are national averages. In economics, we often point out that you can hit that when you just focus on the national average, that can be as misleading as missing the target 3 feet to the right and 3 feet to the left and then yelling, "I hit it." On average, you were right. Well, to some extent, state pre-K looks like that because progress in indeed where each state is overall is highly uneven across the states. We move to the next slide. We look at moving forward. There are nearly 1.4 million children enrolled, mostly 4-year-olds. That makes state pre-K bigger for this age group than Head Start or subsidized child care. New York stood out for its rapid expansion of access and funding. I'll have more to say about that later. Hawaii and Mississippi stand out as being included for the first time among the states funding pre-K programs for the full year. And as I mentioned earlier, Indiana has funded a pilot program. Next slide. If we look a little deeper, we find, of course, as I said, 8 states still don't fund any state pre-K program. 3 states, California, Florida, and Texas, enroll 40% of all of the children in state-funded pre-K. Now, that's part because those states have very large percentages of all preschoolers, but it's also because they have relatively large pre-K programs. And so it's especially troubling that 2 of those big states, Florida and Texas, decreased enrollment. And so as a result, enrollment nationally went up very modestly, adding just 31,000 children across all ages. And some programs enrolled children at ages other than 3 and 4, either younger or older. And if we take a somewhat longer view, we see that since 2010, the percentage of the 3 and 4-year-old population enrolled is up just 1 percentage point. At that growth rate, it will take decades to reach even half of the 4-year-olds. And 4-year-olds are served at a much higher percentage, right, about 30% than 3-year-olds. And it would take us basically 150 years to get anywhere close to enrollment of all preschoolers. If we move on to the next slide, here you get a picture of how enrollment's increased over time. You can see 4-year-olds have gone from 14% to 29%, 3-year-olds from 3% to 5%. Enrollment increased by 22,000, looking at just 3 and 4-year-olds. You can see 13 states actually decreased their enrollment, while 28 states went up. The vast majority of children served are 4-year-olds. If we move to the next slide, you'll get a better picture of just how this varies from state to state. There does seem to be some regional pattern. It's certainly not just the East or the South that has high levels of preschool enrollment. It's North and South and East and West. But once you reach the mountain states, it falls off considerably from the rest of the country in terms of enrollment. And I think that is an interesting pattern, to say the least. It matters a great deal whether you have access to free pre-K, what state you live in. If you live in Florida, Oklahoma, West Virginia, or Vermont, pretty much school starts at 4. For half the kids in Texas, that's true. Similarly, in Wisconsin, more than half the kids in Iowa as well. But if you go to some other states, it's simply not offered at all. That's huge variation compared to what you would see in K-12, for example. Move on to the next slide, please. We look at how much states are investing in pre-K. States are spending $6.2 billion of their own money. That's an increase of over $500 million from the prior year, which is good news. The somewhat more sobering news is that 2/3 of that come from New York alone. 8 states did increase funding by more than $10 million. 3 states decreased funding by more than $10 million. So again, you see that pattern of, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That is one of the reasons nationwide progress is so slow. If we go to the next slide and look at funding per child, you can see funding per child was on a kind of long-term decline until we hit the Great Recession, and then it took a nosedive, and we still haven't quite recovered from that. That is, we're not back to the levels of 2008, 2010 in terms of per child spending, despite an over $300 per child increase last year. And that's the biggest single-year increase we've seen in 15 years. State funding per child went up in 25 states. It dropped in 16. 3 states, per child spending fell by more than 10%. 8 states increased it by more than 10%. Those are probably the same states increasing and decreasing by more than $10 million. If we move on to the next slide, you'll get a picture of what that looks like from state to state. You can see where your state falls. Again, as with enrollment, there are very large differences among the states, and they don't necessarily overlap with, the states that are leading on funding per child are not necessarily states that are leading on enrollment, although some states do well, in fact, on both. Moving on to the next slide, we look at what we call the Quality Standards Checklist, and these are benchmarks for minimum policies. These are based on research. If you were to say, what are the 10 features of highly effective programs? These are the minimums you would see in them, not actually what programs did, or certainly not maximums. But they're benchmarks for things we think if you move past this, you are not likely to produce the kinds of results that people have talked about as coming from high-quality pre-K. Reducing the achievement gap, increasing the average achievement levels, decreasing school failure, decreasing grade retention in special education, and producing big economic gains. Right? So part of my job over the last 30 years has been documenting the economic benefits. Those only come from high-quality programs. Right, so you can see these are for early learning standards, whether teachers have a 4-year college degree, whether they have specialized training, whether assistants have a qualification requirement, whether at least 15 hours of in-service professional development are provided, a maximum class size of 20 or less, teacher-child ratio of 1 to 10 or better, that some screening and referral services are provided. So, for example, can the child see? Do they have adequate hearing? At least 1 meal a day is provided. And whether there's some direct monitoring of the quality of service, that someone goes and visits and sees that our program's actually doing what they're supposed to. And you can see states vary considerably and programs vary considerably in the extent to which they do these. The one that's met by essentially every program is that they all have good, comprehensive early learning standards. But it varies a great deal from there. If we move on to the next slide, we did see some progress on these quality standards. 6 programs met additional ones. 7 programs now meet all 10. Unfortunately, if we look at those 3 states that enroll such a huge percentage of the kids, you'll see that California, Florida, and Texas are at the bottom in terms of meeting these minimum quality standards. Texas, for example, has no limits on class size or ratio. Florida has essentially no teacher qualifications requirements beyond having a high school diploma. So again, if we move to the next slide and look at a map, you can see that it matters a lot where you live in terms of quality standards. And the pattern isn't what one might naively guess, right? So the states that meet all 10 do not tend to be states that are unusually wealthy, for example. West Virginia, North Carolina, or Alaska are states that meet all 10. Other states that do very well, also all 10 is Alabama and Mississippi. Other states that do well, you can see there is a kind of cluster in the southeast of states that meet these minimum quality standards. Moving on to the next slide. I'm just going to go over this briefly because A, it's very small, and B, you can look at this in the yearbook, but it gives you some sense of trends over time. You can see, for the most part, trends in these have been upward. The one that hasn't been is really the site visits to verify actual quality. Those took a hit during the recession because I think they're relatively expensive, but they were easier to cut than sending kids home. But they're really important for ensuring that you're not just articulating high standards, but meeting them. We'll move on to the next slide. This gives you a sense, I think, of what can be done in a short period of time. As I said, looking at current rates of progress, just to enroll all children in poverty, we could be looking at many, many decades. New York City in a single year added 53,000 full-day seats. Well, that's actually in 2 years. At high-quality standards, the state added nearly $400 million and increased spending per child by 70% in a single year. Where there's a will, there's certainly a way. Moving on to the next, I think it would be clear from the map that support for pre-K at the state level is really not a partisan issue. And if we look beyond where states are to progress has also been very bipartisan. 6 of the top 10 states for enrollment had Republican governors. Half of the states meeting all 10 benchmarks for minimum standards were led by Republicans. Some of the states that made the biggest increases in the last year, I singled out New York. Obviously, they have a Democratic governor and mayor in New York City, but Michigan and Alabama were also standouts and have been for several years in terms of increased support for state pre-K. Other states that have done quite well include Louisiana and New Mexico, also with Republican leadership. If we move on to the next slide, just to give you an idea of what's on these state profile pages, you can see this is the kind of information you can get on your state. Tell you how your state's been doing over time, how your state compares to other states, and provide some more context on how many kids are enrolled in other kinds of programs besides state pre-K, how much is spent on Head Start, how much is spent on K-12, how does that compare to spending on pre-K. And there's actually a description in text that gives you some details about what is the program, what is its history, and how does it work. Moving on. The next slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of all of the information that's in the appendix. As I said, there are hundreds of survey questions. They cross all of these areas. You get very, very detailed information on your state and on other states. And the information on other states allows you to see, well, if my state isn't doing something, what might we learn in this area from other states? but also if my state is doing something, how many other states are doing the same kind of thing. Next slide. This is where we begin our deeper look into dual language learners and the workforce in terms of policy. By dual language learners, what we mean are children who come from homes where English isn't the primary language, but they're virtually all learning English as well as the home language. Of course, what we worry about is they may not be learning English well and they may not be learning the home language well. We move on to the next slide. In terms of children's home languages, I believe we are the first place to provide an estimate of the percentage of children in each state and nationally at 3 and 4 who come from homes where a language other than English is spoken. That's 1.85 million kids. It's almost 1 out of every 4 preschool children, but it varies dramatically from state to state. So it's only 2% of the children in West Virginia. It's 45% of the children in California. So knowing that 1 out of every 4 kids comes from a home where English isn't the first language doesn't really tell you anything at all about where your state is likely to be. We move on to the next slide. The next thing I would want to know beyond what percentage or how many children in my state are dual language learners is, well, how many of those kids do we enroll in state-funded pre-K? And we can't give you an answer to that. In fact, only 14 states know the answer to that because they collect the data. Most states don't even collect that information, and so they don't know. All right, if we move on to the next slide, and then we began asking about, so what policies are supportive? And the first one that stands out for us is whether teachers know the language of the child or have qualifications for teaching children whose language is not English. This is a complicated task. It's complicated enough to teach young children well. When you add that they may not speak English or that they are trying to master 2 or more languages at the same time, that job gets even tougher. Well, only 8 state pre-K programs in 5 states require teachers to have qualifications related to this. If we go to the next slide, as we summarize a little information about other relatively common policies, whether home language is an eligibility criterion, that is one of the things that can get you in, whether you're an English language or dual language learner. Whether recruitment and enrollment materials are provided in the family's home language. You can see that's the most common, but it's still not a policy in most states. I don't think it's a stretch for anyone to see why that might be a problem, right? That if parents can't read or understand the materials about preschool availability, they're going to be much less likely to try to enroll their child. And we do, in fact, know that for the largest population of English language learners who are Hispanics, they are much less likely than other children to be enrolled in state-funded pre-K. Now remember those 3 states that have huge numbers, California, Texas, and Florida? You would think as a result of that, Hispanics would be more likely to be in pre-K rather than the opposite, given the percentages of dual language learners that live in those states. Are children required to be assessed in their home language? You can see that's very rare. Again, the teacher requirements. And then do programs get more resources? based on serving dual language learners. We think that's important because we think it's more expensive, but you can see that only 9 states do that. Moving on to the next slide, where we're looking at workforce, you can see 33 programs require teachers to have a 4-year college degree. The National Academy of Sciences, Institute of Medicine, spent, I think, over a year developing what's a 600-page report that comes to the conclusion, given what we want these teachers to do, they need at least a 4-year college degree to have the initial knowledge base and skill set required. And yet, many programs, right, there's 57 of them, only 33 require teachers to have a 4-year degree. And of course, that's not enough because, as you'll see, preschool teachers tend to make far less. Only 16 programs require salary parity for lead teachers, and if you dig a little further, it's really only Hawaii, Missouri, New Jersey, Oklahoma, and Tennessee that require all of their pre-K teachers, no matter where they teach, if they're funded by the state, to be paid not just entry-level salaries, but throughout their career at the same level as K-12 teachers. So that's only 5 of the states. Preschool teacher salaries lag K-12 teacher salaries by $10,000 to $30,000. That's a lot of dough, and you can see why programs might have trouble holding on to teachers. Minimum degree requirement, if you want to see how that looks from state to state, you can see that in the map. It varies considerably by state. And if we then look at salary parity in the next slide, you can see 16 states require for teachers the same starting salary, 14 the same salary schedule, but often given that number I gave you before of 5 states, what this means is only if they are located in public schools in most of these states. Far fewer require salary parity for assistant teachers with assistants in K-12. Even fewer require that they receive the same kinds of fringe benefits. And only 10 require that they get the same kind of planning time and professional development. We think that's important because the key to whether having a qualified, adequately paid teacher matters is whether that teacher delivers good teaching. If they don't have time to plan, to work together with their supervisor, with other teachers, to be coached in the classroom, they're not going to be good teachers. Given how few states make that a requirement, we see that as a very serious problem. Going on to the next slide, we look a little further at workforce supports. One way you can encourage people to enter the field is to offer scholarships or loan forgiveness. That's relatively frequent. It approaches half of the programs. Offering mentoring, much more rare. Job-embedded professional development, less than half. Paid planning time, you can see that's about 8 states. And offering bonuses, I'm guessing that's 1 state that offers a bonus for performance. So with that, we move to the next part of our webinar where we'll be doing questions. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That's a tremendous amount of information to process, and I just wanted to remind our audience that we have a chat box in the bottom left corner for questions. Feel free to type those in at any point during the presentation. And moving on, with the inclusion of DLLs into the 2015 yearbook, we at NCSL put together a few questions for Steve. The first, how can state policymakers use the information on DLLs? And with limited resources, what are the areas that are the best to focus on?
Well, I think the first thing is looking at how big an issue is this in my state, right? If I'm in West Virginia, there are probably only a couple of places in my state I need to worry about it. If I'm in California, I have a huge issue. Most states obviously are in between. Getting some sense of how big an issue this is for your state's the first step. And then the second is, does my state program actually collect data on the percentage of DLLs enrolled? Right, so that's the second thing I would want to look at. And then the third would be, are we making the information about this program available in home languages? Right? And maybe you can't hit every home language, but you can certainly hit the top ones in your state. It is relatively inexpensive to do that because you only have to do it once to make it available, to translate it once to make it available to every person in the state who speaks that language year after year, perhaps with minor revisions when the program changes. So those are the places I would start. After that, I would move on to what kinds of supports do we provide in terms of guidance from the state to the local level, additional resources, professional development to help teachers deal with what really is a difficult issue, but which is also a tremendous opportunity. Right? Those of you who are familiar with education issues more generally know that the United States has historically done a terrible job of preparing our kids for a multilingual global economy. When we have lots of children from homes where English is not the first language, building on that is a tremendous opportunity to develop the 21st century language skills our kids are going to need to succeed in the economy of the future.
Great, thank you. The next question, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and West Virginia have been identified as providing strong supports for preschool-age DLLs. What can other states learn from these states?
Well, I think that they can learn about the, it's one thing to say that they require teachers to have this qualification, or they make their materials available in home languages, or they provide professional development statewide so that their teachers are better able to support dual language learners. But it's a much bigger advantage to then go to some of these states, perhaps one of them that's more like your state, and find out exactly how they do it, which a lot of that information is in the yearbook, but if there's not enough there, there's typically a link to a website where you can go and either get the information or get the contact for the person who can tell you, so that somebody in your state can then figure out how to replicate, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Thank you. The last question on DLOs that we've put forth, high quality preschool programs have been demonstrated to have enhanced effects for DLOs. Can you further explain this?
Sure. Most dual language learners also are in low-income households. And many of these low-income households, their parents may not even have completed elementary school. So these kids are doubly or triply disadvantaged. When we look, though, at what happens when they get a good preschool program, we see that they take off like bottle rockets. And so their gains in language literacy and mathematics are by far the largest. So when we see that these kids are less likely to be in programs, but that they get the biggest gains, and in some studies the longest lasting gains. So even some studies where they find fade out, generally they find persistence for these children. So in some ways they're your best bets for big payoff. And when we add to this that we know that we can educate them in build strengths in both the home language and in English without any delay in their English language acquisition, it's just a tremendous win to serve as many of these kids as we can.
Great. So turning over to the preschool workforce, I have a few questions for you, Steve. The first one is you provided a lot of great information on the teacher workforce. So how can state policymakers use this information? So what teacher development support policies should states be focusing on? Should they be doing more with scholarships and loan forgiveness, professional development, bonuses, mentoring? Can you give us some advice?
Well, I'm an economist. The thing that stands out the most for me is the salary disparity. I just think that laws of supply and demand apply to government programs just as much as they apply in the private sector. They apply to teachers of young children just as much as they apply to teachers of older children, or indeed to higher education. You are lucky to get what you pay for. You certainly do not get what you don't pay for. And so qualifications requirements are really pretty meaningless if you don't pay adequate salaries. And I hear from program directors constantly who tell me that one of their biggest challenges is not just the turnover rate, but that their best teachers are the ones that they lose. They lose them to public schools, they lose them to the private sector, because many teachers are making borderline poverty wages. In fact, in Head Start, where teachers are actually paid a little bit better on average than in many state pre-K programs, a third of the teachers are clinically depressed. Now, I think that's directly related to the conditions in which they live. And that you can, and we know there's a huge literature. Adults who are depressed are not good at interactors with young children.
Okay, thank you. So another question I have here is, so you mentioned the 16 pre-K programs that report policies requiring salary parity for lead teachers. So I was just wondering if we could dig a little deeper on that. Does a BA translate into higher pay? And then with that, why is there such a big difference in pay between the preschool teachers in the public preschools versus the non-public preschool settings?
Well, I'll start at the overall level with I think it is largely about how pre-K programs are financed. They do not have the same kind of financial backing that K-12 does. If they were part of the K-12 formula, and where they are part of the K-12 formula, right, where preschools are funded just like the rest of public education, then you find that teachers have the same qualifications and pay, and you don't have the brain drain problem. Unfortunately, that's not how most state pre-K programs are financed. Most of them are year-to-year appropriations from the legislature, and the inevitable tendency is to spread too little money over too many kids, and inevitably that means pushing down teacher pay, even if the qualifications would seem to dictate higher pay. Now, the difference between public school and private within the same program really comes down to another issue of financing, which is, my state, for example, appropriates $4,500 per kid, and we give that to you whether you're a public school or a private provider. The public school can match that with another $4,000 because they can raise revenue through the local tax base. A private child care center that's providing state pre-K, they don't have any other place to turn to. They can turn to philanthropy, but they don't have the same kind of capacity to raise anywhere near that kind of matching funding, and that's the basic reason.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. So we're going to wait for a few more questions to funnel in here, but just to kind of follow up back to DLLs, 23 states report the number of DLLs served. Can you tell us why identifying that number is so important, and what are the implications of not identifying those students?
Well, this really goes back to these kids will have, without pre-K, will enter kindergarten with the biggest achievement gap. Once kids get into school, those achievement gaps tend to persist. So they're going to end up with the highest dropout rate down the line. Knowing that you're reaching those kids before they get to kindergarten is really important. If you don't count them, you don't have any idea whether you're reaching them or not.
Thank you. We did have a question kind of touching on your comment about pre-K teachers being depressed. How does that population compare to K-12 teachers?
I don't know that anybody's done the comparison. It is much, much higher than in the general population, and much, much higher than in the general population of people with college degrees. So it is a very elevated level. It looks more like what's true of people in poverty generally, who are under considerable stress. Right? You're one misfortune away from being in poverty yourself. You have a major auto repair, you can't pay for it, you can't get to work, you lose your job. And it is understandable then why people have psychological distress. K-12 teachers are not in the same kind of situation.
Thanks. I just want to remind folks again of the chat box. Please put your questions in there and we'll get to them. I have a question going back to your slides, Steve, regarding the minimum standard benchmarks. So I guess it's just more of, you talked about it being a checklist and how it represents a set of minimum criteria, But what does this mean for a state policymaker? So if a legislator is looking at this and they see their state pre-K program has a 10, does that mean that there's no more work to be done?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. A 10 means that you hit the minimums. It doesn't mean you have a good to excellent program. And there are two reasons for that. One is implementation can be pretty far off from what's intended by the policy. The policies are really largely about resources and not whether they're used well. And so it's vitally important that every state program have a continuous improvement system and accountability and system in place.
Okay.
That assesses whether you're actually getting good results or not. Now, if you know you're not getting the results you'd like, and you see that you have some serious holes with respect to minimum standards, like with respect to teacher education requirements or class size limits, then you have a sense of where to look for problems. And all 10 of these are not equal, right? So that, and it matters why you miss it. You know, state can miss the meals requirement because they only offer a snack. And most of their programs are half day. Well, that's not nearly as serious as you miss it because you have 35 kids in a class with one teacher.
Right. Next question.
We had a question come in from Nebraska where they are focusing on access for children in poverty. Has there been any analysis of access/participation for children in poverty versus all children by state?
Well, so this is another one of those issues about state-collected data. Most states can't tell you whether the children in their program are in poverty or not. They can't accurately report on family income. So there isn't any way to know. Now, some people assume that if our program is targeting low-income children, that means that all the kids in the program are low income. Now, one problem with that is that most states have 1 or 2 to a dozen other criteria besides income, even when they target low-income kids. But even if income is really your only or your major criterion, it's a moving target. Right? So that, for example, Head Start, which only enrolls children in poverty, there's an exception for that now, but it didn't used to be. If you go back in the day when it really was a hard cutoff at the poverty line, by the end of the 4-year-old year, half the kids in Head Start were not poor. So it is a question you can't simply rely on because we got kids in, that's the percentage of our children in poverty that are served. First, you have to know if the kids in your program really are low income. And then, of course, the second thing is that when you did your roundup in the spring and identified the low-income population, by the time you get to the fall or, say, December, not only are some of the children that you enrolled no longer low income, but some of the children who didn't qualify as low income in the spring are now low income. So it turns out to be a very difficult question to answer. That's made impossible by the fact that most states don't even collect the data.
Interesting. So I have a question for we have some folks from states that do not currently have a state-funded pre-K program. So I was just wondering if you had any advice for them on which states to look at in terms of, maybe a state piloted something or, had some sort of wins right away. So if you could just mention that.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of states to look at, and part of who you look at depends on who looks like you. Indiana is an interesting state because they've just started a pilot, started in Indianapolis, and it's very innovative in terms of approach to funding and all of the people from around the state that they've involved in setting up an evaluation. Alabama is a state that started small, but with very high quality, but has then moved relatively rapidly to expand their program basically as fast as they could and keep the quality where they wanted it. Maine, I think, is a very interesting state for a lot of the states that don't have programs now because they're a big rural state, right? They're a state that's got a lot of territory to cover, much of which is sparsely populated, where you have issues of transportation and lack of infrastructure in rural areas, and so they've had to deal with, I think, a lot of the same issues that states in the plains and mountain states would have to deal with. So those are some of the places that I would start with.
Thanks, Steve. So we're nearing the hour to end this webinar. So I just wanted to thank Steve so much for his thoughtful comments and presentation. Thanks again, Steve. This information was great. I did want to mention that there are some resources available to the webinar participants. CELO, the Center on Enhancing Early Learning Outcomes, produced a report on early childhood teacher education policies. They go into the review of state trends, and they get into a little deeper into some of the things that Steve talked about with the workforce issues and what the yearbook tracked. And then also NCSL has our own DLL resource available, and it's part of the shared files in the media library, and you can access it there. And then also, I wanted to mention that we also have a tracking database where you can go in and track preschool issues and look at the database to see what legislation has been proposed and enacted. The Early Care and Education Project has a database. Matt also tracks it in through the P3 world, so please look to those resources. And then I wanted to remind folks that this webinar is going to be available shortly on the web. You'll get an email of the archived version when it's available. Your feedback is so important to us and very beneficial, so we will have an online survey that's going to be emailed to you right when we finish this webinar. It's so quick. It's 7 questions, very quick. Please take a few moments to fill it out. We take your feedback very seriously, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. I want to make a plug for NCSL's Legislative Summit, and registration's now open. The meeting's going to be in Chicago, August 8th through the 11th. You can get all the information at ncsl.org/summit. And then just wanted to mention that we are here for you. NCSL is here. Our staff is here. So if you have any questions with this webinar or any other questions regarding our early childhood, feel free to email the Early Care and Education Project team or Matt in the education program. And that is it for me. I wanted to thank again everyone for being on the call. And Steve, hope everyone has a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. Thanks.